"Sign it," her uncle said, sliding the paper across the table. "Or get out by morning." Clara Whitmore stared at the document. A transfer of the last thing she owned, her mother's land. Her hands were shaking. She was 18 years old, alone, and standing in a kitchen that had never once felt like home. She didn't sign. She walked to her room, pulled out a worn newspaper clipping she had been hiding for 3 weeks, and read the words one more time. "I offer a home, respect, and honesty." And she made the most terrifying decision of her life. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Clara Whitmore had learned very early that silence was a form of survival, not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of a Sunday morning or a field after rain. The silence she knew was different, calculated, careful, the kind you maintained so that no one had a reason to raise their voice at you. The kind you wore like armor every single day just to make it to the next one. She was 18 years old, and she had been wearing that armor for most of her life. Her parents had died of fever when she was 9. First her father, then her mother. 6 weeks later, as if her mother simply refused to stay in a world her husband had already left. Clara had no memory of the funeral, only the cold. Only the strange smell of her Aunt Ruth's house camphor and boiled vegetables, and something underneath it all that Clara could never name but always associated with dread. Ruth Whitmore was not a cruel woman in the way that villains are cruel in stories. She never hit Clara. She never screamed at her in public. What she did was quieter and in many ways more damaging. She treated Clara the way you treat a piece of furniture that is useful but not particularly loved. You use it, you maintain it just enough to keep it functional. But you never once think about what it might feel like to be that piece of furniture. Clara cooked breakfast before dawn. She cleaned the kitchen, the parlor, the upstairs hallway, and the back steps. She did the family's laundry, not just Ruth's, but Ruth's husband Gerald, their 2 grown sons, and their daughter Miriam, who was 1 year younger than Clara, but spoke to her as though Clara existed one full social class below whatever Miriam inhabited. "You missed a spot," Miriam would say, pointing at a window pane without looking up from her book. Clara would go back and clean the spot. She never said anything, because saying something cost too much. She had tried once when she was 13. Ruth had given away Clara's mother's sewing box, a small cedar box with a painted blue flower on the lid, the only object Clara still had that smelled faintly of her mother, to a neighbor's daughter without asking. Clara had said quietly that the box belonged to her. Ruth had looked at her for a long moment. "It belongs to this household," she said, "as do you." Clara never tried again. But here is what nobody in that house ever understood about the girl who kept her silence and her head down and her hands constantly busy inside that stillness. Clara Whitmore was always thinking, always watching, always cataloging what she saw and filing it somewhere deep and protected where no one could take it from her. She noticed when Gerald cheated at cards with his sons, and nobody called him out. She noticed that Ruth bought new silk ribbons for Miriam every month, but never once thought to ask if Clara needed new shoes, even when winter came and Clara's boots had a hole near the left toe that she stuffed with newspaper. She noticed that the men who came to the house for dinner spoke about women the same way they spoke about property, with casual ownership, with a tone that assumed possession. And she filed all of it away, not out of bitterness, out of understanding. She was learning exactly what kind of world she had been born into, and she was learning very quietly that she did not intend to stay in it forever. The newspaper had come into her hands by accident. She had been delivering a basket of clean laundry to a boarding house on Pemberton Street, one of the small paid tasks Ruth allowed her to do on Saturday afternoons. Though Ruth kept the money, when a gust of wind pushed the door of the reading room open and scattered several pages across the front steps. Clara gathered them automatically, the way she gathered everything, without being asked, without thinking, out of pure habit. She was about to set them on the hall table when a headline caught her eye. "Honest Men of the West Seek Wives Correspondence. Marriage Arrangements Available to Women of Good Character." She stood there on the steps for a full 30 seconds. The wind was cold. The laundry basket was heavy. She should have kept moving. Instead, she read. There were several advertisements. Most of them made her uneasy. The language too eager, too desperate, or worse, too specific about what the men expected in return for what they were offering. One man wanted a woman who could manage a large household staff. Another was blunt about wanting children within the first year. And then she found the one at the bottom of the column. It was shorter than the others. No flowery language. No promises. Rancher. 30 Montana Territory. Silver Creek. Small operation, honest work, quiet life. I am a lonely man, seeking someone willing to build a life together. I offer a home, respect, and honesty. Nothing more. Nothing less. Inquire to E. Callahan. She read it 3 times. Then she folded the page very carefully and put it inside her boot against the newspaper she was already using to keep out the cold. She thought about it for 3 weeks before she did anything. In those 3 weeks, she told herself every reasonable thing. She didn't know this man. She knew nothing about Montana. She had no money of her own. She had no way of getting herself to a train station, no way of buying a ticket, no guarantee that any of this was real. She had heard stories. Women who answered advertisements and arrived to find something entirely different from what they had been promised. Women who ended up in terrible situations with no way out. All of that was true. But this was also true the night her uncle told her to sign the paper. Something inside her finally stopped pretending. Chapter 2. The paper. The letter. The point of no return. It happened on a Tuesday. Clara had come downstairs for breakfast and found Gerald already at the table, which was unusual. Gerald rarely appeared before 9. The fact that he was there at 7, fully dressed with a document on the table in front of him and a pen set beside it, sent a cold understanding through her before he said a single word. Ruth was standing near the window with her arms crossed. Miriam was not in the room. Neither were the sons. "Sit down, Clara," Gerald said. She sat. "You are 18 now," he said. "This arrangement we've had you living here, being fed, being clothed, working," Clara said. Gerald's eyes flicked up. It was the first time in several years that she had interrupted him. "Working," he agreed, his tone flattening slightly. "And in exchange for that work, you've had a roof and meals. But you're a grown woman now. Ruth and I have discussed it, and we feel it's time for a more formal arrangement." He slid the paper across the table. Clara looked at it. It was a transfer agreement. Her parents had owned a small parcel of land outside the city. Not much, Ruth had always told her. It was nearly worthless. But it had been her parents' land, and therefore Clara's. She had known it existed. She had never known exactly how to access it or what to do with it. But she had held on to the knowledge of it, the way you hold on to something in the dark, not because you can use it right now, but because you need to know it's there. Gerald wanted her to sign it over to him. In exchange, he said, "You may continue to live here and work as you have been." Clara looked at the paper. She looked at Gerald. She looked at Ruth, who was still at the window, who had not turned around. "And if I don't sign?" Clara asked. Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Then this arrangement ends. You're a grown woman. There's nothing requiring us to house and feed a grown woman who isn't family." "I am family," Clara said quietly. "You're the late Thomas Whitmore's daughter," Gerald said, "which made you family when you were a child. But that obligation has run its course." Clara sat very still. The room was quiet except for the sound of the fire and faintly the street noise from outside. She thought about the newspaper clipping in her room, the one she had been carrying in her boot, until she memorized it, then transferred to a hiding place behind the loose board under her bed. "I am a lonely man, seeking someone willing to build a life together. I offer a home, respect, and honesty." "I need to think about it," Clara said. "There's nothing to think about," Gerald said. "Then I'll need until morning. she said, and stood up. He started to say something else. She walked out of the kitchen before he could finish the sentence. She had already written the letter. That surprised even her when she admitted it to herself that some part of her had known this moment was coming before it arrived and had already begun preparing. The letter to E. Callahan in Silver Creek, Montana, was written on a single sheet of paper she had purchased herself with coins saved over 6 months from the laundry delivery work. She had written it 4 times before she was satisfied. She had been careful not to make it sound desperate, though she was. She had been careful not to make promises she couldn't keep. She had been honest about what she was and what she wasn't. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 18 years old in good health and accustomed to hard work. I have no family wealth and no formal education beyond what I taught myself from borrowed books. I am not writing to you because I have many options. I am writing because your advertisement was the first thing I have read in years that offered honesty rather than fantasy, and honesty is something I understand. I do not know if I would be what you are looking for, but I would like the chance to find out. She had been holding the letter for 3 weeks waiting. That night, after she walked out of the kitchen, she sealed it. In the morning, she mailed it before Gerald woke up. Chapter 3. The Answer That Changed Everything. His reply came 11 days later. Clara had been checking the post every day, with a calm she didn't feel walking to the box at the end of the street, with her expression neutral, her heart beat loud, telling herself it didn't matter. It was probably nothing. He had probably already chosen someone else. She should start making other plans. She had no other plans. His letter was shorter than hers, but it was enough. Miss Whitmore, your honesty is exactly what your letter promises it to be. I am not a wealthy man, and I will not pretend otherwise. The work here is hard, and the winters are harder. But I mean what I wrote. A home, respect, and honesty. Those things I can give. If you are willing, I will arrange for your fare. You only need to say yes. E. Callahan. Clara read it standing at the end of the street in the cold. Then she went back inside, climbed the stairs, and sat on the edge of her bed. She thought about her mother. Not a specific memory, just the feeling of her. The smell of her hair. The particular sound of her voice reading aloud in the evenings. The way she had always told Clara that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was knowing exactly how frightened you were and moving forward anyway. I'm moving forward, Clara said quietly to the empty room. Then she wrote back, yes. Ruth discovered the plan 4 days before the train was scheduled to leave. She had found the travel documents Ethan had arranged. Everything had sent the fare as promised, had included a detailed list of what she would need for the journey hidden inside Clara's pillowcase during one of the routine room checks she did every month. The confrontation happened in the kitchen. Ruth did not raise her voice. She never did. This is madness, Ruth said. You know nothing about this man. I know what he wrote, Clara said. Words on paper. Anyone can write words on paper. Ruth set the documents on the table. You are going to throw yourself into the wilderness with a stranger because of words on paper. I've been living with people I know for 9 years, Clara said, and it hasn't gone particularly well. Ruth's expression shifted. Something crossed her face that might have been guilt if Clara had believed Ruth capable of it. She wasn't sure anymore. You have a roof here, Ruth said. You have meals. I have work, Clara said. That's not the same thing. You could find work in the city, a respectable position, a factory, or... I could, Clara agreed. Or I could go somewhere that might actually become a home. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Clara never forgot, not because it was cruel, but because it was the most honest thing Ruth had said to her in 9 years. I hope you know what you're doing, Ruth said quietly, because no one is going to come looking for you if it goes wrong. Clara met her eyes. I know, she said. That's been true for a long time. She picked up the documents from the table. She went upstairs. She packed her suitcase, one suitcase everything she owned, which fit with room to spare, and she didn't look at Ruth again until the morning she left. And even then, it was only a glance. Ruth stood in the doorway of the house. Gerald was somewhere behind her, not visible. Miriam had not come down. Clara picked up her suitcase. "Thank you," she said, because she had been raised to say it for the years. Then she walked to the end of the street without looking back. Chapter 4. The Train West and the Fear That Followed. The train was the loudest, most overwhelming thing Clara had ever experienced. She had never been on one before. She had seen them. Everyone in Boston had seen the trains, but seeing and being inside were two entirely different things. The noise, the speed, the way the world outside the window transformed so rapidly that it didn't seem real. The strangers packed into the car around her, all with their own lives and their own purposes and their own destinations. Clara sat with her suitcase on the rack above her, and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched. She had a window seat. She had arranged this deliberately, had asked the conductor with a specificity that surprised even her, because she needed to see what was happening outside. She needed to see the world changing. It was the only way she could convince herself that she was actually moving, that this was actually happening, that she had actually left. The cities fell away. Then the towns. Then the towns thinned to something that barely counted as towns, a handful of buildings clustered together in the middle of nothing, a water tower, a church steeple, and then fields. Fields endless and flat, and wider than anything Clara had words for. A woman across the aisle noticed her staring. "First time out west?" the woman asked. She was somewhere in her 40s, well-dressed with a direct way of speaking that Clara immediately liked. "First time anywhere," Clara said. The woman smiled. "Where are you headed?" "Montana Territory, Silver Creek." The woman's expression shifted slightly. Not alarm, more like consideration. "That's remote country." "I know." "You have family there." Clara thought about how to answer that. "I will," she said. The woman studied her for a moment. "Are you a mail-order bride?" The phrase landed differently than Clara expected. There was no judgment in the woman's voice. It was a simple question, but Clara felt the weight of it anyway. The way other people would hear those words, the assumptions they would carry. "I'm going to meet someone I've corresponded with," Clara said carefully. "That's the same thing," the woman said, not unkindly. "Nothing wrong with it. My cousin came out that way 15 years ago. Married a farmer in Colorado. Has 4 children and a house she loves." She paused. "And I have another friend who went out the same way and had a very different experience." Clara looked at her steadily. "What happened to your friend?" "She managed," the woman said. "She had to fight for it, but she managed. That's the thing about going out there. You have to be the kind of person who can manage." "Are you saying you don't think I can?" "I'm saying I have no idea," the woman said honestly. "I just met you." "But you're here, aren't you? That tells me something." Clara turned back to the window. She was here. That did tell her something. The question was whether it was enough. The further west the train traveled, the more her fear transformed. It didn't disappear. She would be lying to herself if she said it disappeared. But it changed shape. The fear of leaving, the breathless, stomach-dropping terror of the first hours gradually became something different. Something that had more texture to it. A more specific and therefore more manageable fear. She was afraid he would be nothing like his letter. She was afraid she would arrive and find a man who had written what he thought she wanted to hear, the way people always wrote what they thought you wanted to hear. And behind the words, there would be something else entirely. She was afraid she would have traded one difficult life for a worse one. But underneath all of that, below the specific fears, below the rational calculations, she kept running through her mind, there was something else. Something smaller and quieter and harder to name. She was afraid she would arrive and he would look at her and be disappointed. Not that he would be cruel about it, just that he would look at her worn coat and her second-hand boots and her single suitcase and the dark circles under her eyes from years of not quite enough sleep, and something in his face would close, and she would know instantly that she had come all this way, and it was not going to be what she had hoped. That fear was the one she couldn't reason herself out of. So she did what she had always done when she couldn't reason herself out of something. She kept moving. Chapter 5. Silver Creek. The station at Silver Creek was smaller than any station she had passed through on the journey. Clara stepped off the train into cold air that hit differently from Boston. Cold, drier, sharper, with a clarity that made her eyes water immediately. She stood on the platform with her suitcase and looked around. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform. A man collecting freight. 2 women talking near the far end. A child chasing something. A couple meeting someone they clearly knew well, the greeting loud and warm. And there, standing slightly apart from all of it, was a man. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Taller than she had pictured, though she wasn't sure why she had pictured him any particular way. He wore a brown coat that had clearly seen years of use and a hat with a brim that kept the sun out of his eyes. He wasn't looking at her yet. He was scanning the train, looking for her, and she had a moment to observe him before he found her. He had a plain face, honest, the kind of face that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. There were lines around his eyes that suggested either too much sun or too much worry, or both. His jaw was set, but not hard. He looked like someone preparing for something that might go wrong. Then he found her. Their eyes met. He didn't smile. Not immediately. He just looked. Really looked, the way people rarely looked at her, the way people almost never looked at her, as if she was worth looking at properly. Then he walked toward her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Steady. "Mr. Callahan," she said. They stood a foot apart on the platform, and the awkwardness of the moment was so complete and so human that Clara almost laughed. 2 people who had exchanged the most honest letters they had ever written, now standing in front of each other, with absolutely no idea what to say next. "You came," he said finally. "I came," she confirmed. He reached for her suitcase. She let him take it, and then immediately felt strange about letting him take it, and then told herself to stop cataloging every small decision. "I thought we'd—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to go straight to the ranch, or if you'd rather—" Another stop. He seemed to be assembling his thoughts one at a time. "I booked a room at the inn, in case you needed time." Clara blinked. "In case I needed time," she repeated. Before the arrangements were finalized." He was watching her carefully, as if trying to read whether this was the right thing to say. "You've just traveled across the country, and you don't know me, and I thought if you needed time to decide—" "You're giving me a choice," Clara said. He looked slightly confused by her tone. Of course. She had not expected that. She had prepared herself for many things on this platform. She had prepared herself for disappointment and for awkwardness, and for the particular deflation of reality, not matching hope. She had not prepared herself for a man who looked at her like she was worth looking at, and then handed her back the decision she had assumed was already made. She felt something move in her chest. Not love. She was too careful for that, too wary, had seen too many people mistake relief for love and paid the price for it. But something. Something that made the cold feel slightly less sharp. "I don't need time," she said, "but thank you." He nodded once. Something in him settled slightly. "The church is on Maple Street," he said. "Reverend Hayes, we can go when you're ready." "I'm ready," she said, and she was. Chapter 6. The First Night as Mrs. Callahan. She was not ready. She understood that fully approximately 20 minutes after the brief plain ceremony in Reverend Hayes's church, when she was sitting in Ethan Callahan's wagon on the road out of Silver Creek toward the ranch, and the reality of what she had done arrived in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She was married. To a stranger, who was sitting 3 feet away from her on the wagon seat, driving with a focused silence that she couldn't read at all. The road was rough. The horse was a dark bay with a calm temperament that Clara noted because she had no experience with horses and needed to notice things. The sky overhead was the deepest, most uninterrupted blue she had ever seen. No buildings cutting it up, no smoke from factories, just sky from one horizon to the other. And it should have been beautiful, but right now, it mostly felt like evidence of how far she was from everything familiar. "Are you warm enough?" Ethan asked without looking at her. She was, actually. The coat she had bought with the last of her own money before leaving Boston was doing its job. "Yes." "It'll get colder," he said. "The Montana winters." He stopped himself. "You'll need better gear. I should have thought of that before you arrived." "I can manage what I have for now." "I'll get you what you need in town," he said. This week, she didn't argue. Not because she was used to not arguing, she had been used to, that had trained herself into it, but she was consciously trying not to let that pattern follow her into this new life. She didn't argue because there was something in the way he said it that wasn't an order. It was a statement of intent, a plan. The kind of thing you say to a person you intend to take care of. She filed that away. They rode in silence for a while. Then she asked, "How long have you had the ranch?" He glanced at her sideways, as if he was slightly surprised by the question, but not unpleasantly so. 6 years, he said. "Came out from Illinois when I was 24. Alone. With my brother." A beat. "He died 4 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens out here." The flatness of those 4 words told her more about the years since his brother's death than any longer answer would have. "It does," she agreed. "I lost my parents to fever when I was 9. He turned to look at her more fully this time. Something shifted in his expression. "Then we've got that in common," he said. "At least one thing," she said. He looked back at the road, but the silence after that felt different. Less like 2 strangers sitting next to each other, and more like 2 people who had just recognized something familiar in the other. The ranch was not what she had imagined. It was smaller, more weathered. The house was solidly built but plain, with none of the small details that make a house feel like a home. No curtains in the windows, no plants near the door. Nothing hanging on the porch. It looked like a place where a man worked and slept, and that was all. But it was solid. The roof looked sound. The barn was in better repair than the house. There was a well near the side of the building, and a woodpile stacked high, and a fence line that ran straight and true into the distance. He had been taking care of the things that mattered, just not the things that made a place warm. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down first, then offered his hand to help her down. She took it. It was a practical offer, not a formal one, she could see that, and felt the roughness of his palm, the evidence of years of outdoor work. "It's not much," he said, looking at the house. "It's yours," she said. Then after a moment, "Ours." He looked at her. She looked back. "I can make it better," she said, not as a promise to impress him, but as a simple statement of fact. "Not immediately, but I can." He nodded slowly. "I believe you." She picked up her suitcase from the back of the wagon. Inside the house, he showed her the kitchen, the small sitting room, the bedroom, his bedroom, which was now theirs, which was an awkwardness she would navigate, and the small back room that he said she could use for whatever she needed. The house smelled like wood smoke and leather and something faintly animal, and also underneath everything like loneliness. The particular smell of a space that had only had one person in it for too long. "I'll make supper," she said, because it was something she knew how to do, and right now she needed to do something she knew how to do. He started to say that wasn't necessary. "I know it's not necessary," she said, cutting him off gently. "I want to." He nodded, left her to it, and as Clara Whitmore. Clara Callahan now stood in the kitchen of a house she had never seen before, in a territory she had never imagined herself living in. Married to a man she had met 3 hours ago. She did what she had always done in unfamiliar situations. She started with what was in front of her. She found the flour, she found the salt, she rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. Chapter 7. The First Test. The first morning arrived cold and indifferent as Montana mornings apparently always did. Clara was awake before Ethan. She had barely slept, not from fear exactly, but from the newness of everything. The unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, and the horses in the barn, and the wind coming off the mountains that sounded different from any wind she had heard before. She dressed quickly in the cold, went to the kitchen, and had the fire going and coffee on before she heard his boots on the floor. He appeared in the doorway, saw the fire already lit, and the coffee already made, and stopped. "You didn't have to." "You said there were cattle to check before breakfast," she said. "Go check them. Coffee will still be hot when you get back." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between surprise and something warmer that he seemed to be keeping carefully controlled. Then he went. He came back 20 minutes later with cold in his coat and a grim set to his jaw. "One of the fences on the north side came down in last night's wind," he said, sitting at the table. "I need to get it up before any of the herd drifts." "Tell me what you need me to do," Clara said. He paused with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "It's cold out there." "I noticed." "It's not—" He seemed to be choosing words. "I wasn't expecting you to work the fence line." "I wasn't expecting to be here at all 3 weeks ago," she said evenly. "What do you need me to do?" He set the cup down. "Can you handle a hammer?" he asked. "I can learn in the time it takes us to walk to the fence," she said. Something crossed his face that, if she had been watching for it, and she was always watching, might have been the beginning of a smile that he decided not to finish yet. "All right," he said. "Drink your coffee first." "Already did." He shook his head once, stood up, reached for his coat. "Come on then," he said. And Clara followed her husband out into the Montana morning, into the cold she was not yet dressed for, and the work she did not yet know how to do. And she felt beneath the cold and the uncertainty and the very reasonable terror of a life that still had no guaranteed shape, the smallest, most careful, most guarded beginning of something that might in time be called hope. The cattle were wild-eyed from the cold. The fence post took 4 tries to set right. Clara's hands bled twice before Ethan noticed and told her to stop, then showed her the proper grip. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. By the time the fence was repaired and the herd was settled, and they walked back toward the house with the sun finally cresting the mountain line and turning everything briefly gold, Clara realized something had shifted. She had done it wrong twice and right once, and nobody had called her worthless. Nobody had told her she should be grateful just to be there. He had shown her the right way to hold the hammer. That was it. That was all it had taken. She did not know yet what Ethan Callahan was carrying inside him, the grief, the years of quiet, the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped expecting anyone to stay. She did not know yet what was waiting for them in Silver Creek, the gossip, the skepticism, the eyes that watched a young bride from the east and made their judgments before she had spoken a word. She did not know yet how hard the next months would be, but she knew the weight of the hammer in her hands. And she knew that for the first time in a very long time, someone had stood beside her and shown her how to do a difficult thing instead of simply expecting her to fail at it. It wasn't much. But Clara Whitmore. Clara Callahan had spent 18 years learning how to build a life out of very little. She intended to start. The hammer had taught her something, not just how to drive a post. How to stand next to a man who did not expect her to fail and discover that her hands were steadier than she thought. Clara carried that small knowledge into the days that followed, the way she had once carried her mother's memory carefully, deliberately, as something too fragile to drop. Because she had been disappointed before. She knew how fast a person's kindness could reveal itself as performance. She knew the difference between a man who was good on the first day and a man who was good on the 100th. She had not known Ethan long enough to know which kind he was. So she watched, and she worked, and she waited. The ranch demanded everything she had from the moment she woke until the moment she collapsed into bed at night with her arms aching and her boots still on. The chores alone, feeding the animals, hauling water. keeping the fire going through the night, managing the kitchen with supplies that were adequate but not generous, would have been enough to exhaust most people. But Clara had been waking before dawn and working until midnight for 9 years. The physical labor was not new. What was new was that nobody was standing over her counting her mistakes. That alone made her feel like she could breathe for the first time in years. On the 4th morning, she found the kitchen window so frosted over she couldn't see through it. She was scraping it clear with a knife when Ethan came in from the barn, stomped the mud from his boots, and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "That's been like that for 2 winters," he said. "I noticed," she said without turning around. "There's a trick to it. You heat a rag on the stove first and press it against the glass." She turned and looked at him. "You've been doing it the hard way for 2 years. He looked momentarily embarrassed in the way men who live alone get embarrassed when someone points out they've been tolerating something unnecessarily. "I kept meaning to, I never—" He stopped. "There are a lot of things on the ranch that I've been meaning to get to." "Tell me what they are," she said. He looked at her steadily. "All of them. All of them." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, he actually told her. Not a summary, not a polite abbreviated version of the list, all of it. The leaking corner of the roof that he'd patched twice without solving the actual problem. The hinges on the barn door that screamed every time the wind came from the north. The storage room in the back that had become so disorganized he'd stopped looking for things in it and had started buying replacements in town instead. The kitchen in here, he paused slightly as if aware he was cataloging her domain that he had functionally stopped using except for the most basic necessities, because making a real meal for one person had started to feel like too much effort for too little reason. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The roof is your job, the hinges I can do, the storage room I'll take this week. The kitchen is already solved." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to fix everything at once," he said, not as an order, as something more careful than that. "I know," she said, "but I'm better when I have a list." Something moved in his face. She wasn't sure what it was, but he nodded once, and it felt like the beginning of an understanding between them. That was the morning she started to believe this might actually work. She was wrong to believe it that easily. The first real test of her life in Silver Creek did not come from Ethan. It came from town. On the 6th day, Ethan said he needed to go into Silver Creek for supplies and asked if she wanted to come. She said yes before he finished the question, partly because she needed to see the place where she was going to be living, and partly because she had been talking to nobody but Ethan for 6 days, and even a quiet man's company had limits. The general store was managed by a heavy-set man named Dillard, who greeted Ethan with the comfortable familiarity of long acquaintance, and then turned to look at Clara with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of a person forming a judgment. "This the one from Boston?" Dillard asked Ethan, as if Clara was a piece of equipment Ethan had ordered and was now delivering. "This is my wife," Ethan said. "Clara. Eastern girl," Dillard said, still not quite addressing her. "How's she finding it out here?" "She's standing right in front of you," Clara said pleasantly. "You could ask her." Dillard looked at her then, really looked with the slightly startled expression of a man who had expected less. "How are you finding it out here?" he said pointedly. "Cold," she said, "and big, and nothing at all like what I expected." She held his gaze. "I find that I like it." He made a sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite skepticism and moved to help Ethan with the list. But Clara had seen the shift. A small one. An adjustment. She filed it away. The real blow came from outside the store on the way back to the wagon. 2 women were talking near the post office, both of them probably in their 40s, well-dressed by local standards, the kind of women who were clearly pillars of whatever passed for Silver Creek's social architecture. One of them called to Ethan as they passed, and he stopped with the politeness of someone who knows he cannot avoid a conversation. "Ethan Callahan," the taller of the 2 women said with a wide smile that had something sharp behind it. "We heard you'd gone and done it." "Mrs. Hargrove," Ethan said. "Mrs. Tilson. This is Clara, my wife." Mrs. Hargrove turned to Clara with a smile that did not move up to her eyes. "All the way from Boston," she said. "My goodness, and so young." 18, Clara said. Well, the word carried enormous weight for something so small. Mrs. Hargrove looked at Ethan briefly. "You must have been very determined," she said to Clara, "coming all this way for someone you'd never met." "I corresponded with my husband before I came," Clara said. "I'd argue that's more information than most young women have when they marry." Mrs. Tilson's eyebrows went up slightly. "The mail-order arrangement," Mrs. Hargrove said, as if clarifying, as if the words themselves were the point. "The what arrangement?" Clara said, keeping her tone perfectly even. A small silence. "Well," Mrs. Hargrove said again, "Clara had a long journey," Ethan said, his voice quiet but with something underneath it. "We should get back." He put his hand briefly at the small of Clara's back, not possessively, not in the way of a man staking a claim, but in the way of a man indicating clearly which side he was standing on, and they walked to the wagon. They didn't speak until they were out of town, and the road was empty on both sides. Then Clara said, "She's going to keep doing that." "Probably," Ethan agreed. "Does it bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you?" "It used to," Clara said honestly. "People in Boston had particular ways of making sure you knew your place. I spent a long time letting it get inside me." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I've decided I'm not doing that anymore." He glanced at her sideways. "Just decided that, did you?" "I decided it on the train, actually. I had a lot of time to think." He made a sound that was definitely closer to a laugh than anything she'd heard from him yet. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, but the corner of his mouth was doing something. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Another pause. Honest this time. "Someone quieter," he said. "Someone who needed more time before she started rearranging things." "Are you complaining?" "No," he said, and this time he did not try to stop the small smile. "I'm not." She looked back at the road, felt something warm settle in her chest that she refused to name yet. It was too soon to name it. She had spent 18 years paying the cost of hope offered too quickly. But she let herself feel it anyway, just for a moment. Then she put it away where it would be safe and went back to watching the road. The second week brought its own challenges, none of them the kind she could win with stubbornness alone. The cattle were Ethan's domain, and she understood clearly that she was not supposed to pretend otherwise, not because he said so, but because she was practical enough to know that expertise mattered, and that pretending to knowledge she didn't have would cost them both. But she watched everything. She asked questions 1 or 2 a day, never more than that, because she had noticed that Ethan answered single questions fully, but went quiet when he felt crowded. He was a man who'd had a lot of silence. He had organized himself around it. She worked with that rather than against it. What she didn't tell him, what she couldn't yet find the words to say, was that she was afraid in a different way now than she had been on the train. On the train, she had been afraid of what she was arriving to. Now, she was afraid of something she hadn't predicted. She was afraid of wanting this too much, because the ranch was starting to feel in the smallest and most cautious of ways like something that might one day be a home. And she had learned from 9 years in Ruth's house that wanting something to feel like home and having it feel that way were two entirely different things, and the gap between them was exactly the size of a person's most private heartbreak. So she worked. She organized the storage room, which turned out to contain, beneath the chaos of years of deferred sorting, an old rocking chair with a broken spindle, 3 wool blankets in perfectly good condition, a box of seed packets for a kitchen garden that had apparently never been started, and a small crate of books. She sat down on the dusty floor with the crate in her lap and opened it and found novels mostly. Mark Twain, Bret Harte, 2 volumes of history that had lost their covers. And at the very bottom, a Bible with an inscription inside the front cover that read, For Ethan and James May, this house be a home. Love, Mother. 1878. She sat with that for a long time. James was the brother who had died. She put the Bible on top of everything else, closed the crate, and carried it carefully into the sitting room. That evening after supper, she set it on the table. Ethan came in from checking the herd and stopped when he saw it. "I found this in the back room," she said. "I thought it should be somewhere you can see it." He didn't move for a moment. "You read the inscription," he said. "I did. I'm sorry, I should have asked before." "No." He crossed to the table and looked at the crate. His hand went to the Bible and he picked it up carefully. She watched his face and saw something move through it that he was not able to fully control and did not try to. "We came out here together," he said after a moment. "James and me. He was 26. I was 24. We had $80 and a letter of credit and about half the skills you'd actually need to make a go of it." He ran his thumb over the inscription. "He died in March. It was a fast fever. 3 days from healthy to gone." "I'm sorry," Clara said. 4 years I've been here by myself." He set the Bible down carefully on the table. "You get used to it, and then you don't." He looked at her directly. "I didn't put a notice in that paper because I wanted someone to cook for me. I want you to know that." "Then why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was with the directness of a man who had decided honesty was easier than its alternative. "Because I was tired," he said. "Not from the work, from the quiet, from eating alone every night in a house that used to have 2 people in it." He paused. "James used to talk through dinner. Every night, no matter what had gone wrong during the day, he'd find something to say. I used to think it was exhausting." He looked at the table. "I'd give a great deal to hear it now." Clara looked at him across the table. This was the man behind the letter. This was what honest actually looked like, not polished, not strategic, just true. "I talk during dinner," she said. He looked up. "Not as much as your brother, maybe, but I talk." She straightened the Bible slightly on the table, centering it. "I'm also told I have opinions about most things, which apparently some people find challenging." He was quiet for a beat. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, Ethan Callahan actually laughed. It was a short sound, a little rough from disuse, but real, and it changed his entire face. Clara felt something pull in her chest that she did not name and did not put away. She just let it stay. At the end of the second week, Martha Ellis arrived. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it. She had been splitting kindling on the side of the house, a task she had taken on after Ethan showed her the technique 3 days ago, and she had decided she liked the particular satisfaction of it. And when she looked up, a woman in her late 30s was already halfway down from the wagon seat, with the ease of someone who had been climbing off wagons her whole life. She had red hair going gray at the temples and a broad, frank face, and she was carrying a covered pot that smelled like it contained something with sage and onions. "You must be Clara," the woman said without any of the studied assessment Clara had encountered from Mrs. Hargrove. Just a direct human statement. "I'm Martha Ellis. My husband Frank runs the spread 3 miles east. I meant to come sooner, but we had a calf down, and then the weather turned." She held out the pot. "Venison stew. Because I remember my first month out here, and cooking while you're learning everything else at the same time is not a reasonable ask." Clara took the pot. Her hands were still rough from the kindling. She did not feel the need to apologize for this. "Thank you," she said. "Would you come in?" "I was hoping you'd ask," Martha said, and followed her inside. Martha Ellis was, Clara discovered over the next 2 hours, the kind of woman who asked direct questions and waited for real answers, and who offered information about herself with the same lack of ceremony. She had come to Montana from Ohio 14 years ago, she said. She had met Frank 2 weeks after she arrived and married him 3 weeks after that. She had lost 2 children and raised 3 others, and buried a horse she had loved more than was strictly reasonable, and built a kitchen garden that she described with a pride bordering on ferocity. "The winters will knock you flat the first year," Martha told her with the comfortable certainty of experience. Every woman who comes out here says the same thing. You think you're prepared, and then January arrives and you understand that you were not prepared. I've been cold before, Clara said. Not like this, Martha said not unkindly. Boston cold is something you walk through to get to somewhere warm. Montana cold is what happens when somewhere warm stops being guaranteed. Clara thought about that. What's the worst of it? She asked. Not to be frightened, but to be ready. Martha looked at her with something that shifted toward respect. Being cut off, she said. When the storms come, you don't go anywhere. You can't. Days at a time, sometimes a week or more, just you and whoever's in the house with you and whatever supplies you had the sense to lay in beforehand. She paused. Some couples that cuts to the bone. They discover they've got nothing to say to each other and nowhere to go. Some couples. She left that finished or unfinished. Clara wasn't sure which. How are you and Ethan? The directness of the question was almost startling. I've known him 2 weeks, Clara said carefully. I know that, Martha said. I'm asking anyway. Clara thought about the laugh at the dinner table, about the hammer in the fence post, about the way he had put his hand at the small of her back when Mrs. Hargrove had been sharpening her words. Carefully, she said finally. We're finding our way carefully. Martha nodded slowly. Good answer. What do you mean? I mean that carefully is the right speed for it. Couples who come out here expecting some storybook thing usually have a hard landing. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Ethan's a good man. He's been carrying a lot of grief, and he doesn't let people close. But he's good. She looked at Clara directly. He chose you specifically, you know. He told Frank he got several letters. He chose yours. Clara went still. She hadn't known that. He didn't say why, she asked. He said yours was the only one that didn't ask him to be something, Martha said. Said all the others talked about what they wanted. Yours talked about what you were. Clara looked at the table. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't have words for yet. She cleared her throat. The seed packets in the storage room, she said. There's a kitchen garden that was never started. Martha recognized the change of subject and accepted it with grace. What are you thinking about planting? I'd need to know what actually grows out here, Clara said. What's worth the effort and what isn't? Martha set her cup down with the look of a woman who has been asked exactly the right question. Now that, she said, I can tell you everything about. They talked until the light outside shifted, and Martha said she needed to get back before dark, and when she stood to leave, she stopped at the door and looked at Clara with an expression that was warm and completely unperformed. I'm glad he wrote that advertisement, Martha said. And I'm glad it was you who answered. Clara walked her to the wagon. After the sound of Martha's wheels faded down the road, she stood for a moment in the cold with her arms crossed against her chest, looking at the house. At the windows that were no longer frosted. At the smoke from the chimney that meant there was warmth inside. She heard the barn door, the one with the shrieking hinges she had already fixed open and close, and Ethan appeared around the corner of the house, saw her standing there, and slowed his walk. Martha leave? He asked. Just now. He came to stand beside her, not close but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold afternoon. She give you the winter speech? He asked. The one about January. That's the one. She did. Clara looked at the house. She told me you chose my letter specifically, that you had others. A beat of silence. I did, he said. You could have told me that. I didn't want you to feel obligated, he said quietly. To feel like you owed me something for choosing you. She turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead. Why mine? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she had learned was not avoidance, but thought. Everyone else wrote about what they needed, he said finally. A home security safety. Which is fair, those are honest reasons. He paused. You wrote about what you were, what you actually were. You wrote that you weren't much your words, but that you were real. And then you asked for a chance, not a guarantee. He finally looked at her. I didn't want to give a guarantee, he said. I just wanted someone who would show up and actually try. Clara held his gaze. Then I'll keep doing that, she said. Showing up and trying. He nodded slowly. Something in his face was doing what faces do when a person decides to let something in that they've been keeping at a careful distance. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She turned back toward the house. After a moment he walked beside her, not touching, just beside her. And that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. 3 weeks in the town found them. Not Dillard, not Martha, not even Mrs. Hargrove. The town itself, in the particular way of small communities, where everyone knows everyone's business before the people involved have sorted it out themselves. It started with the mercantile, where Dillard apparently felt no obligation to keep to himself the fact that Ethan Callahan had married a mail-order girl from Boston, and the information traveled. The way information in small towns travels, not maliciously necessarily, just inevitably, until by the end of the 3rd week, Clara could walk into any establishment in Silver Creek and know that the pause before the greeting was the sound of people adjusting what they'd been saying about her. She didn't fall apart over it, but she felt it. She felt it the afternoon she went to pick up thread from the dry goods store. And the 2 women ahead of her in line went quiet in a way that meant they had been talking and weren't anymore. She felt it when the Reverend's wife asked her with careful sweetness how she was finding the adjustment. She felt it most on the Saturday when she was in the post office, and a man she had never met looked at her and then looked at Ethan standing beside her and said loudly enough to be intentional, "Callahan heard you got yourself one of those arranged women. How's that working out?" Ethan went very still. It was the kind of still that Clara associated not with passivity, but with a man deciding very deliberately what he was about to do next. "Her name is Clara," Ethan said. "And she fixed the barn hinges I'd been putting off for 2 years, reorganized the storage room, and made the best beef stew I've had since my mother was alive." He looked at the man levelly. "So I'd say it's working out fine." The man blinked, said nothing else. Ethan picked up the mail and walked outside. Clara followed him. On the boardwalk, she said nothing for a moment. Then, "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to. I can handle people like that myself." "I know you can," he said. "I wasn't handling it for you." He looked at her. "I was saying what I actually think." She looked at him for a moment. That she realized was the difference. He wasn't defending her. He was telling the truth. And the truth happened to be in her defense. She let that sit in her chest all the way home. She didn't name what it felt like, but she stopped keeping it at quite such a careful distance. By the end of the month, Clara had learned the rhythm of the ranch the way you learn the rhythm of a person, not by studying it, but by living alongside it until it becomes the shape of your days. She knew when the cattle needed moving before Ethan said it. She knew the particular sound the wind made before a heavy snowfall. She knew that Ethan took his coffee without sugar in the morning, but with it in the evening, that he had a habit of fixing things in order of urgency, rather than order of preference, and that he read for 20 minutes every night before sleeping one of the books from the crate in the storage room, working through them methodically. She knew that he was not an easy man to know, and that this was not a flaw but a fact, and that the knowing was worth the patience it required. And Ethan was learning her too. She could see it in the way he started accounting for her in his plans. Not assuming, not directing, but including. "I was thinking about moving the south herd next Tuesday. Does that work for what you're planning in the garden?" Small sentences that recognized her as a person with her own schedule, her own projects, her own legitimate claim on the shape of their days. Nobody had ever spoken to her that way. She had to practice not showing how much it mattered. One evening, at the end of the first month after the dishes were done and the fire was banked and the particular quiet of a Montana night had settled over the house, Ethan looked up from his book and said, "You're not what Boston made you think you were." She was mending a shirt by the fire. She didn't look up immediately. "What do you mean?" she asked. "The way you talk about where you came from," he said. The things you say about yourself when you think you're just stating facts. He paused. They made you think less of yourself than you are. She looked at him then. His expression was simply honest. No agenda, no attempt to charm. Just a man telling his wife something he thought she should know. I know that, she said after a moment. Do you? He asked, genuinely. She thought about it. I'm working on it, she said. He nodded, went back to his book. She went back to the mending. But her hands were not quite as steady as they had been before he spoke. And the firelight when she looked up at it seemed brighter. The month closed. November arrived. The sky turned the color of iron. And somewhere in the space between the hammer and the fence post and the dinner table and the book crate and the sound of a man laughing, for the first time in what felt like years, Clara Callahan stopped asking herself whether she had made a mistake. She still didn't know what this was yet, but she knew clearly, quietly, with the careful certainty of someone who has learned to trust only what she has witnessed herself, that whatever it was, she intended to stay. November came in like a warning, not the storm itself that was still weeks away, but the feeling before it. That particular pressure in the air that the ranch animals responded to before any human thought to look at the sky. Clara had been in Montana long enough by then to read those signs, or at least to notice that Ethan read them and to watch his face when he did. He'd go quiet in a different way. Not his usual thoughtful quiet, but something more weighted, more alert. The kind of quiet a man carries when he knows something difficult is coming and is already calculating how to meet it. She had learned to read him the way she had learned everything else out here, not by asking too many questions at once, but by paying attention to the spaces between the things he said. And in the first week of November, the spaces got larger. You're worried, she said one evening, not as a question. He was looking out the window. He turned at her voice, and she saw him decide in real time whether to give her a partial answer or a full one. He gave her the full one. The forecast from Dillard's last supply run wasn't good, he said. His contact from Billings said this winter could be the worst in a decade. If it comes in hard before I get the south herd moved to the lower pasture, I could lose cattle. He paused. A lot of cattle. How many? Enough to matter. Clara set down what she was doing. Then we move them early. The ground's not ready. Is it more not ready than losing the herd? He looked at her for a moment. She could see him running calculations. She didn't have the knowledge to run herself adjusting variables she hadn't learned yet. No, he said finally. It's not. Then tell me what I can do. He did. And the next 3 days were the hardest physical work Clara had done since arriving, longer than the fence, longer than the storage room, more demanding than anything she had attempted yet. She didn't complain. Not once. Not because she was performing toughness, but because she genuinely understood what was at stake, and understanding the stakes had always been enough to push her through things that should have stopped her. By the time the south herd was settled in the lower pasture, she was so tired she fell asleep at the dinner table. She woke up with a blanket around her shoulders that she had not put there herself. She looked at Ethan across the table. He was eating like nothing had happened. You covered me, she said. You were cold, he said. She looked at the blanket, at her hands on the table still rough from 3 days of work. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded once, not looking up from his plate. But his jaw was doing something. The particular thing it did when he was keeping an expression controlled that didn't entirely want to be controlled. She looked back at her food and felt something fill the center of her chest that she had finally quietly stopped trying to name. It was the second week of November when Silver Creek showed her a different kind of cruelty than the one she had prepared for. She had gone into town alone for the first time. Ethan was occupied with a fence repair that couldn't wait, and she needed supplies that couldn't either. And she had been in Silver Creek enough times by now to know the layout, know the people, know which ones would be polite and which ones would be performing politeness while thinking something else entirely. She was at the dry goods counter when she heard it. She wasn't meant to. The two women were at the back of the store, speaking in the lowered voice that people use when they want to appear discreet but actually want their words to travel. Heard she came with nothing. One suitcase. Not even proper winter clothing. Well, what did Ethan expect you advertise for a wife like you're ordering seed grain? That's the quality you get. I feel sorry for her, honestly. A girl that young, no family, no prospects. Of course she took the first offer. Desperation isn't something to judge. I'm not judging. I'm saying it won't last. Men like Ethan need a certain kind of woman. Someone who knows this land, knows this life. Not some city girl playing at ranching. Clara stood at the counter with her list in her hand, and her face absolutely still. The woman behind the counter, young, the daughter of the owner, had gone slightly pink. She had heard it too. Will that be everything? She asked Clara too quickly, too kindly. Yes, Clara said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. Thank you. She paid. She picked up her parcels. She walked out. She got halfway to the wagon before her hands started shaking. Not from the cold. She stood beside the wagon and breathed through it. In and out. The way you do when you need to let something pass through you without letting it take root. She had practice at this. Years of practice. She had heard worse in Ruth's house, said more quietly, with more plausible deniability. But she had thought she had started to believe that here was different. Mrs. Callahan. She turned. Martha Ellis was crossing the street toward her with the purposeful stride of a woman who had seen something and made a decision. I heard them, Martha said without preamble. Through the wall. The walls in that store have always been paper thin. Her expression was direct and unapologetic. Are you all right? I'm fine, Clara said. Reflex. Martha waited. Clara exhaled. No, not entirely. Good, Martha said. Fine would have worried me. Fine means you're pretending, and pretending is how things fester. She steered Clara firmly to the bench outside the post office and sat them both down. Those women, Martha said, have lived in Silver Creek their whole lives. They have not had an original thought between them in 20 years. They decide what something is before they look at it, and then they spend the rest of their lives being right about everything. She paused. Do not let them decide what you are. I'm not planning to, Clara said. I know, but there's the difference between not planning to and actually not doing it. Martha looked at her directly. How much of what they said got inside? Too much. Enough. Then here's what you do with it. You go home. You look at what you've built in 6 weeks on that ranch, and you remember that those women have never built anything harder than a reputation. Clara looked at her hands. She said it won't last, Clara said quietly. That I'm not the right kind of woman for this life. The right kind of woman for this life, Martha said, is the kind who shows up when it's hard. That's it. That's the whole list. She met Clara's eyes. You've been showing up. I've seen it. Clara nodded slowly. Something inside her, the part that had started to close around the wound of those words, loosened slightly. Come for supper Sunday, Martha said, standing. Bring Ethan. Frank has been asking after him, and I have things to teach you about preserving before winter actually arrives. She said it the way you say something that is decided, not proposed. All right, Clara said. Good. Martha squeezed her arm once and walked away. Clara sat for one more minute on the bench. Then she stood up, picked up her parcels, and climbed into the wagon. She did not look back at the dry goods store. She drove home. She did not tell Ethan what she had heard. Not that night. Not the next day. She was still deciding how much of her interior life was his to know, still navigating the boundary between the privacy she had always kept out of necessity and the openness that a real partnership would eventually require. She wasn't ready to tell him everything yet, but she was also aware that keeping it entirely to herself would let it sit in her chest and calcify, and she had enough calcified things already without adding more. So she said it obliquely, the way you do when you need to say something without saying all of it. How long did it take, she asked him that evening, before people here stopped seeing you as a newcomer? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. 3 years, he said. Maybe 4, before I stopped feeling like one. 3 years, she repeated. Does that bother you? She considered the honest answer. I didn't think it would. I thought if I worked hard enough, people would adjust faster. She paused. I'm finding out that some people have already decided what I am, regardless of what I do. He was quiet for a moment. Did something happen in town? He asked. She almost said no. Then she said, I heard some things at the dry goods store. Nothing I didn't expect exactly, just said out loud when I could hear it. His jaw tightened in the way it did when something made him angry that he wasn't planning to express carelessly. Who? He asked. It doesn't matter who. Clara. It matters what, she said. Not who. The what is that I'm always going to be the mail-order girl from Boston until I'm something else more obviously. And I'm trying to figure out what that something else looks like. He looked at her for a long moment. You fixed the barn hinges, he said. She blinked. What? Those hinges have been screaming since James was alive. Every person who came to this ranch for 4 years heard them. Every one of them said something about it. None of them fixed them. He held her gaze. You fixed them in the 2nd week. She didn't know what to say to that. I'm just telling you, he said, what I see. When other people decide what you are, they're deciding based on where you came from. I'm deciding based on what I've watched you do. He paused. Those aren't the same measurement. Clara looked at the table. She felt the thing in her chest again, fuller this time, more insistent, harder to keep at a careful distance. You're getting harder to be cautious about, she said. He looked briefly confused. What does that mean? It means, she said, that I've spent a long time not letting people matter too much, because people who matter too much can hurt you. She looked up at him. You're making it difficult to maintain a sensible amount of distance. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a complaint? He asked. I'm not sure yet, she said honestly. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile. Something more than that, actually. Something quieter and more lasting. Let me know when you figure it out, he said. She would. Sunday at the Ellis Ranch was the first time Clara felt something she hadn't felt since she was a child sitting in her mother's kitchen. She felt like she belonged somewhere. It wasn't grand. Frank Ellis was a broad, practical man who expressed warmth primarily through making sure everyone's plate was full and offering second helpings before first ones were finished. Their children, 3 of them ranging from 6 to 14, treated Clara with the frank curiosity of young people who haven't yet learned to pretend they're not looking at someone. The 6-year-old, a girl named Bess, climbed onto the bench beside Clara at dinner and asked her without introduction whether Clara knew how to braid hair. I do, Clara said. Will you show me after dinner? Bess, Martha said from across the table. Clara is a guest. It's all right, Clara said. She looked at Bess. After dinner, yes. Ethan, sitting beside her, said nothing, but she felt him look at her briefly and then look away, and the looking had something in it that she stored away to examine later. After dinner, while Clara braided Bess's hair with the careful, practiced movements she had spent years doing for Miriam without ever being thanked for it, she could hear Ethan and Frank talking in the next room. Not the words, just the rhythm of it. 2 men talking the way men talk when they are comfortable with each other. Easy. Occasional silences that didn't need filling. She heard Ethan laugh at something Frank said. The same laugh she had first heard at the dinner table in their kitchen. The slightly rough-edged one. The one that sounded like something coming back after a long absence. Bess twisted to look at her. Are you married to the tall man? I am, Clara said. Hold still. He looks sad sometimes, Bess said with the devastating candor of 6-year-olds. He's been lonely, Clara said simply. He's getting better. Bess considered this. My mama says you came from very far away. Boston. Is that far? Very. Were you scared? Clara finished the last braid and tied it off. "Yes," she said. "I was scared the whole way." Bess turned around to look at her directly. "But you came anyway." "But I came anyway," Clara agreed. Bess looked satisfied with this in the way that children are satisfied when the world confirms something they suspected. Then she slid off the bench and ran into the next room, and Clara sat with the quiet for a moment. She came anyway. She had been scared the whole way, and she had come anyway, and every single day since had required the same decision made again and again in smaller ways. To stay when it was hard. To speak when silence was easier. To let herself be seen by a man who was finally looking. She was still making that decision. She intended to keep making it. The twist arrived in the third week of November, and it came from a direction Clara had not anticipated. It came from Gerald. A letter arrived at the Silver Creek post office addressed to Mrs. Clara Callahan. Her new name on an envelope in handwriting she recognized before she fully processed what she was looking at. Gerald's handwriting. The particular way he formed his capital letters. She stood in the post office and stared at it for a full 30 seconds before she opened it. The letter was brief. 2 paragraphs written in the tone Gerald used when he was performing reasonableness. The first paragraph explained that Ruth had been unwell. Not seriously, he hastened to add, but unwell nonetheless, and that managing the household without Clara's assistance had proven more demanding than anticipated. The second paragraph said that they would be willing to take her back, if things weren't working out. If the situation in Montana had proved difficult, there would be no judgment, he wrote, no questions asked. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it. She felt many things in the following moments, standing in the Silver Creek post office with Gerald's letter in her hand. She felt the old familiar pull of it, the strange gravity of the place you came from, even when it was terrible, even when you left it deliberately, even when going back would be going backward. She had not expected to feel that pull. She had thought she was past it. The pull surprised her, and then angered her, and then, after a moment, simply informed her, because the anger told her something important. She was angry not because she was tempted. She was angry because he had assumed she would be. He had assumed that 6 weeks in Montana with a stranger would have broken her badly enough to come back. Had assumed she was still the girl who had nowhere left to go. She was still deciding what to do with the letter when the door opened and Martha came in to collect her own mail. She took one look at Clara's face and said, "What happened?" Clara held up the letter. "My uncle. Offering to take me back." Martha read it quickly. Her expression was not complicated. "Well," Martha said, handing it back, "at least now you know." "Know what?" "That you've been gone long enough that they notice the gap." She met Clara's eyes. "That's not nothing. That means you were doing real work. Invisible work, the worst kind, but real." Clara looked at the letter in her hand. "He thinks I'm struggling," she said. "Are you—" She thought about the cattle drive, the fire she kept burning through the night, Bess's braids, Ethan's laugh at the kitchen table, the barn hinges that finally didn't scream anymore. "No," she said, and then more clearly, "No, I'm not struggling. I'm building something." "Then you know what to do with that letter," Martha said simply. Clara looked at it one more time. Then she walked to the small stove in the corner of the post office that was kept lit for exactly this kind of cold weather, and she opened its small iron door, and she put the letter inside. She watched it go. She didn't write back. She drove home through the cold, and when Ethan met her at the door, he had developed the habit of appearing when he heard the wagon, which she had noticed and not said anything about. She said, "I got a letter from Gerald today." He went still. And, "I burned it," she said. His expression shifted through several things very quickly, then settled. "All right," he said. 2 words. That was all. Not a performance of being impressed, not a speech about her strength, not an attempt to make it mean more than it already meant. Just acknowledgement, acceptance, the particular respect of a man who recognizes a decision and doesn't need to make a monument of it. She walked past him into the house. He followed. She had the fire going again before either of them said another word. The second twist, the one that struck deeper, came the following week, and this one came from Ethan himself. He didn't intend it to be a revelation. She could see that clearly afterward, that he had been telling her something as a simple fact, not as a confession, not understanding that it would change the shape of what she understood about him and about why she was here. They had been talking about the spring, planning ahead the way you have to plan in a place where weather makes long-range thinking a matter of survival. She was asking about expanding the kitchen garden, whether the soil on the east side of the house would support it, and he was answering with the kind of detailed land knowledge he had accumulated over 6 years, and in the middle of talking about drainage and sunlight, he said almost casually, James was the one who wanted a family here. He used to talk about it. Said a ranch without children was just a working property, not a home. I thought he was being sentimental. He paused. Turns out he was right. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table. Not dramatic. Just a man saying a true thing. That's why you placed the advertisement, she said slowly. Not just because you were lonely. Both, he said. It was both. You wanted what James wanted. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I wanted what I didn't know I wanted until he was gone. A house that was a home. Someone to eat with and talk to and plan with. He finally looked up at her. I know we haven't talked about, I know it's early, but I want you to know that's what this is, what I was hoping for, not just someone to work the land. Clara sat with this for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. I didn't come here just to work either, she said carefully. I came because I needed somewhere that could be mine. Not a place someone was letting me use. Mine. She looked at him directly. This is starting to feel like mine. Good, he said, quietly. But the word was full. She nodded once. Then she went back to the plans for the garden, and he went back to answering her questions about drainage, and the conversation continued on its surface, while something entirely different continued underneath it. Something that both of them felt. Neither of them named it yet. But it was there. It had been there for a while now, growing in the space between them the way things grow in good soil, quietly, steadily, without announcing itself until one day you look and it has already put down roots. The morning the real storm arrived, Clara was already awake. She had been awake since 4, lying in the dark, listening to the wind change. Not the regular Montana wind she had learned over the past weeks, the constant low geographical fact of it, but something different. Something with more intention, more weight. She got up and went to the kitchen, and started the fire, and stood at the window clean now, no frost obscuring her view, because she had figured out the rag trick and applied it every morning and looked at the sky. It had the color of something that meant business. Ethan appeared behind her, 15 minutes later, already dressed, already reading the same sky she was reading. This is it, he said. How bad? Bad. He was already moving, already calculating. I need to check the herd and get them into the north shelter before this comes in fully. The south pasture fence. He stopped. His jaw tightened. If that fence didn't hold with the wind shift last night. Go, Clara said. Tell me what I need to do here. Keep the fire going. Don't let it go out no matter what. If the temperature drops the way I think it will, we need this house warm. He was pulling on his coat, his movements efficient and fast. The movements of a man who had done this before and was doing it again with more at stake. I'll be back before the worst of it. How long? 3 hours, maybe 4. She looked at the sky again, then at him. Be careful, she said. He met her eyes for a moment. Always, he said. And then he was gone into the gray morning, and the door closed behind him, and the wind outside was already louder than it had been 10 minutes ago. Clara stood in the kitchen of her house, she thought deliberately, completely, and took one steady breath. Then she went to work. She knew what keeping the fire going meant in a Montana winter. It wasn't one task. It was a dozen tasks layered on top of each other: the woodpile, the kindling, the careful management of the draft, the backup fuel. If the main wood ran short, the water that needed to stay unfrozen, the animals in the closer pen that needed checking. She moved through all of it methodically, efficiently, with the focused calm she had developed over 6 years of keeping a household running on insufficient resources. An hour passed. Then 2. The storm came in fully at the second hour. Not gradually. Montana, she had learned, did not believe in gradual. The storm arrived like a decision. One moment the wind was loud and the sky was dark, and the next moment the world outside the window was white. Solid white. Moving white. The kind of visibility that made the barn, which was 40 feet from the house, completely invisible. Clara stood at the window and felt the first real bite of fear. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. He had said 3 hours. It had been 2.5. She went to the door and opened it 2 inches, and the cold hit her with physical force, and the white of the blizzard was absolute. She couldn't see the path to the barn. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the porch. She closed the door. She went back to the fire. She added wood. She checked the water. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the storm, and waited, and did not let herself complete the thoughts that were trying to form in the back of her mind. 3 hours came. He didn't. 3 hours and 15 minutes. 3 hours and 30. Clara stood at the window with her hand flat against the cold glass and made herself breathe evenly and told herself there were 100 reasons he could be late, and all of them were reasonable, and none of them were the one she was not going to think about. At 3 hours and 45 minutes, she put on every piece of warm clothing she owned. She tied a rope to the porch post. She had seen this done in one of the books from the crate, had read about it, the way you read about something you hope you never need, and then find yourself needing, and she looped the other end around her wrist. She opened the door, and she stepped into the blizzard. The rope was the only thing she trusted. Everything else direction distance. The difference between the path to the barn and the open field beyond it disappeared the moment she stepped off the porch. The blizzard didn't feel like weather. It felt like the world had been replaced with something hostile and absolute, something that had no interest in whether she survived it. The cold hit her face like a slap that didn't stop. Her eyes watered immediately, and the tears froze on her cheeks before they reached her jaw. She kept moving, one hand on the rope, one arm up against the wind, feet testing each step before committing weight, because she couldn't see the ground and ice was ice, and a fall out here meant something worse than a bruised knee. She called his name. The wind took it. She called again, louder, with everything her lungs had, and heard nothing back but the storm's own sound, that enormous indifferent howl that made her feel the exact size she was, which was very small. She moved along the rope as far as it reached, which was not far enough. The barn was 40 feet from the house. The rope was 30. She stood at the end of it, with the full length of it taut behind her, and her free hand reaching into nothing, and she made the calculation she'd been dreading. She could go back for more rope, or she could let go. She let go. She counted her steps from the rope's end. 1, 2, 3. She kept her body angled into the wind so it couldn't spin her. 4, 5. The barn had to be ahead of her. It had to be. She had walked this distance 100 times. She knew where the barn door was. She knew the sound the hinges made didn't make anymore because she'd fixed them, which meant she'd lost that auditory landmark, and she pushed that thought aside and kept walking. 7, 8. Her hand hit wood, the barn wall, solid under her palm. She exhaled so hard it became a sound. She moved along the wall toward where the door should be found. It hauled it open against the wind's resistance and pushed inside. The barn was dark and cold, but nothing like the cold outside. The animals were there, the horses shifting at the noise of her entry, their breath visible, their eyes white-ringed and nervous from the storm. She moved through them quickly, calling Ethan's name, and heard nothing. He was not in the barn. She stood in the middle of the barn floor and thought through it fast. If he wasn't in the house and wasn't in the barn, he was somewhere between the barn and the south pasture. The herd shelter. That was where he'd been going. The storm had come in full while he was still out there. She grabbed the lantern from its hook near the door, lit it with hands that were shaking more from cold than from anything she was going to acknowledge right now, and went back out. She turned left along the barn wall instead of right, moving toward the back pasture fence line. She knew the fence was there. She had helped repair it. She had set those posts herself. If she could find the fence, she could follow it to the shelter. She found it 30 seconds later, started moving along it, lantern held high, calling his name into the storm that threw everything back at her. She found him 9 posts in. He was on the ground near the shelter entrance, half sitting against the post, and the sight of him like that, collapsed still in the blizzard, sent something through her chest that was both terror and an absolute refusal to accept what the terror was suggesting. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Ethan?" She grabbed his face with both hands. His skin was dangerously cold. "Ethan, look at me." His eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then finding her face, and the relief that moved through his expression when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on him. "Clara." His voice was wrong, rough and slow. "You shouldn't be out here. A beam." He tried to shift and couldn't suppress the sound it produced. She saw it then, the way he was holding himself, one arm pressed against his side. "Shelter roof gave. Partial collapse. I got the cattle out, but—" He exhaled carefully. "Caught me on the way down." She ran her hands along his side, careful and fast. He pulled in a sharp breath when she reached his ribs. "Can you walk?" she asked. "If you help me up. Then we're going. Right now." She got her shoulder under his arm, got her feet under herself, and pushed. He was heavier than she had accounted for. Or maybe she was colder than she had accounted for. But she got him upright, and she kept him there through pure refusal to consider the alternative. "The cattle," he started. "The cattle are in the shelter," she said. "You got them there. They're fine. Move." He moved. It was the longest 40 feet of her life. She could not explain afterward how she found the barn, then found the rope, then found the porch, then found the door. She couldn't explain the mechanics of it because she wasn't thinking in mechanics. She was thinking in one thing: only keep moving, keep him upright, keep going, keep going, keep going. When the door finally opened and the warmth of the house came out to meet them, Clara made a sound she hadn't planned to make, something between a gasp and the kind of exhale that your body produces when it has been holding something it cannot hold any longer. She got him inside, got him to the chair nearest the fire, got his coat off with hands she could barely feel, and then her own. And then she stood in her kitchen shaking from cold and exertion, and something larger than both looking at the man sitting in the firelight with his eyes half closed and his breathing too shallow. "Don't you fall asleep," she said sharply. His eyes came back open. "Not sleeping. Good. Keep talking to me." She was already moving water on the fire cloths from the shelf, the small medical kit Martha had pressed on her 3 weeks ago with the words, "You'll need this before spring, everyone does." She pulled it open and went to work. "You came out in that," he said, watching her. It wasn't a question. More like he was saying it to make it real. "You were late," she said. "Clara, you said 3 hours." She found the bandaging she needed and came back to him crouched at his level so she could see his face while she worked. "It was 3 hours and 45 minutes. Did you think I was going to sit here and wait?" He was quiet for a moment, watching her face. "I didn't know what to think," he said. I didn't know if the rope trick would occur to you." She stopped, looked at him. "You know about the rope trick," she said. "Learned it the second winter," he said. "James taught me. You tie off to the porch post and—" "I know," she said. "I read it, in one of the books from the crate." She went back to the bandaging. Her hands were steadier now. The cold was leaving them, and feeling was returning, which hurt, but hurt in a useful way. "I read all the books, Ethan. I had 6 weeks with very little else to do in the evenings." He made a sound. She looked up and found that his face, pale, strained, cold-pinched, was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to show how much something was affecting him and failing at it. "I read the history ones too," she said more quietly, "including the one with the inscription." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, some wall that had been up was down. James would have liked you, he said. He would have said you were the most. He had this phrase. He'd say someone was the most real person in the room. That was his highest compliment. He paused. You are the most real person I have ever met. Clara's hand stilled on the bandage. She felt something in her chest open in a way that was not dramatic, not explosive, but complete. The way a lock opens when you finally find the right key, not a violent thing, just a giving way. A release. Hold still, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. I'm not finished. He held still. She finished. She stayed up through the night. Not because he asked her to. He didn't ask. He was asleep within an hour, his body making the executive decision that it needed to repair itself, and sleep was the only currency it had for that. She stayed because she needed to. Because the fire needed tending every 90 minutes, and she was too awake to trust herself to wake at the right intervals, and because there was a part of her that needed to watch him sleep and confirm in the most direct way available that he was here, that he was breathing. That the terrible thing she had been refusing to think about while she walked through the blizzard had not happened. She sat in the chair across from him and listened to the storm outside ease from something violent into something merely severe, and then into something that was just heavy snow. And she let herself think about the last 2 months in a way she hadn't allowed while she was in the middle of living them. She had come here terrified. She could admit that now, in the quiet of this particular night, with the fire between her and the man sleeping in the chair across from her. She had been so afraid on that train. Afraid in ways she hadn't even fully named to herself, afraid of being nothing again, of traveling across the country, only to find that the world had simply rearranged itself into the same shape with different furniture. A different house where she was still the person nobody saw. Instead, she had found this. A man who chose her letter because it told the truth, who gave her a choice on the platform when he didn't have to, who stood next to her in the cold and showed her the grip on a hammer, who put a blanket around her shoulders while she slept and then ate his dinner like it was nothing because he didn't want her to feel obligated by kindness, who called her the most real person he had ever met, and meant it in the same simple way he meant everything, without theater, without strategy, just true. She was in love with him. She let herself know that now, in the dark, in the quiet, after the storm. She had been keeping it at arm's length for weeks, naming it. Careful. Naming it. Cautious. Naming it anything that wasn't what it was. And it was love. She recognized it, not because it felt like the stories she had read, but because it felt like its opposite. Not dizzy. Not performed. Not the desperate grasping of someone who needs to attach to anything. It felt like standing on ground that was solid. It felt like the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been given permission to breathe. She did not plan to tell him immediately. She was still Clara Whitmore underneath all the Clara Callahan she was becoming still. Careful. Still earned trust rather than given trust. Still the girl who had learned the hard way that you did not say the most important things until you were certain they would land in good soil. But she knew. And knowing was enough for tonight. She tended the fire at midnight. At 2. At 4. At 6. The storm was over. At 7. Ethan woke up. She was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard him move. Heard the particular sound of a man discovering the full inventory of his injuries in the unforgiving light of morning. She poured the coffee and brought it to him and sat in the chair across and waited while he took the first careful sip. How bad? She asked. Ribs, he said. 2, maybe 3. Cracked, not broken, or I'd know it differently. He shifted carefully and accepted the confirmation of pain without expression. I've had worse. When? Same shelter 4 years ago. Different storm. He looked at the fire. James got me back to the house that time. The parallel sat between them. I'm not James, Clara said quietly. No, he agreed. You're not. He looked at her directly. You're here. She held his gaze. "I'm here," she said, and it meant exactly as much as it sounded like it meant. She didn't let him get up for 3 days. This was a battle because Ethan Callahan was constitutionally opposed to being stationary, and communicated this through approximately 400 small acts of resistance, shifting toward the edge of his chair, mentioning things that needed doing outside, asking 3 times on the first day whether she had checked the herd. She had checked the herd. She had checked it the morning after the storm wrapped in everything she owned, following the fence line she now knew in her sleep. The cattle were fine. The shelter had partially collapsed on one side, but the side they were on was intact. She had reported this in full, and Ethan had said good, and then 5 minutes later asked if she was sure about the south corner. "I'm sure about the south corner," she said, "because the south corner has a weak post that you replaced in October. I know. I helped you replace it. The cattle are fine, Ethan." He looked at her, then at the fire. "I'm not used to this," he said. "Sitting still. Being taken care of." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to have to get used to it." He didn't argue. But she could see him working at it, the particular effort of a man who had operated alone for long enough that receiving help felt foreign. Not unwelcome, just foreign, like a language he used to speak and had forgotten the rhythm of. She gave him time with it. On the second day, Martha arrived. She came through the aftermath of the storm with the focused momentum of a woman on a mission, knocked twice, came in without waiting, took in the situation in about 4 seconds, and then turned to Clara with an expression that was warm and absolutely serious at the same time. "Frank heard there was trouble out at the Callahan place," she said. "The shelter partially collapsed in the storm," Clara said. "Ethan was inside, cracked ribs." Martha looked at Ethan. "Could have been worse." "It could have," Ethan agreed. "Only because someone went out in a blizzard to find you," Martha said, and looked at Clara. "Frank wants to come fix the shelter when the ground is clear enough. He says you'd do the same for him, and he's right." "Tell Frank I appreciate it," Ethan said. Martha turned back to Clara, and her voice dropped slightly, not in conspiracy, but in the particular register of one woman speaking honestly to another. "How are you?" Clara considered performing fine, decided against it. "Tired," she said. 3 nights of tending the fire, and—" she paused. "I was scared, when I couldn't find him." Martha nodded slowly. "I know that's scared," she said. "Every woman out here knows that's scared. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at moving through it." She squeezed Clara's arm with a grip that was firm and present and real. "You did well." She stayed 2 hours, left enough food to cover 2 more days, told Ethan he was an idiot for staying out that long, which was the most affectionate thing Clara had heard her say to anyone, and drove home. After she left, Ethan said, "She's been like that since I came to Silver Creek. Dresses it all up in plain speaking, but she watches out for the people she's decided to watch out for." "She decided to watch out for me quickly," Clara said. "She decided to watch out for you the day you arrived," he said. "She told Frank that same week that if you lasted 2 months, she'd be one of the best people in the county." Clara stared at him. "She never said that." "She said it to Frank. Frank told me last Sunday when you were in the kitchen with Bess." He paused. 2 months is next week." Clara looked at her hands. Something in her chest was doing the thing it did when she was trying very hard not to show the full size of what she was feeling. "Martha has high standards," she said finally. "She does," he agreed. Then, after a moment, more quietly, "So do I." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze that she had come to understand was simply how he looked when he wasn't hiding anything. He hid less and less these days. She had watched it happen, the gradual opening of a man who had spent 4 years closing around his losses. It hadn't been fast. Nothing real was fast. But it had been consistent, and consistency was the thing she trusted above everything. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, when your ribs are healed and you're back on your feet." She stopped. Started again. "I want to start the kitchen garden in the spring. The seeds from the crate. I want to build it properly with a real border, and I want it to be big enough that we're not buying everything from Dillard by summer." He looked at her steadily. "All right. And I want to put curtains in the front window. Actual curtains, not just the frost." "All right. And I want to write to Reverend Hayes about whether the schoolhouse needs help. I can teach. I know I can. I've been teaching myself for years. I know how to break things down so they make sense." "Clara?" She stopped. "All right," he said again, simply, completely. "To all of it." She nodded once, looked at the fire. Then she looked back at him and said the thing that had been true since the dark of the third night and was going to be true for a long time after. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. His expression did something quiet and complete, nothing dramatic. Just a man whose face told you everything he was choosing not to say aloud because words weren't large enough for it. "I know," he said. 2 days later he was on his feet despite her strongly worded objections, and 1 day after that he was outside doing light work along the fence line, and she watched him from the kitchen window and felt the complicated particular love of a person watching someone they care about be stubbornly, infuriatingly alive. The shelter repair happened the following Saturday. Frank arrived with 2 of his ranch hands before 8 in the morning, and by noon, the collapsed section was rebuilt stronger than it had been before. Ethan worked alongside them slower than usual, and Clara watched him accept Frank's help, with the particular grace of a man who had finally remembered that needing other people was not a failure. That evening, after Frank and his men had gone, Ethan came in and sat at the kitchen table while Clara put supper on and said, "Frank told me something today." "What did he say?" He said Martha told him when I first put the advertisement in the paper 2 years ago, she talked him out of answering it for me. Said I wasn't ready. Said I needed more time. He paused. Then this year she told him the advertisement was a good idea. Said something had shifted. Clara turned from the stove. "She knew you placed it." "Half the county knew. Silver Creek is not a large place." He met her eyes. "She said she'd know the right woman when she saw one respond." Clara stared at him. She read the replies. She didn't read them, but Dillard told her when the letters started coming in because of course he did, and she told Frank she'd be watching. He paused. "She came to the station the day you arrived. You didn't see her. She stood at the far end of the platform." "Ethan?" "She told Frank that evening you were exactly what she'd hoped for." Clara turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and the stove gave her somewhere to put her face. She had thought she arrived here alone. She had believed with the full weight of experience that there was no one watching out for her, that this was entirely uncharted ground, entirely without a net. And there had been Martha Ellis on the platform watching from the far end, already deciding. "She never said anything," Clara said when she trusted her voice. "She wouldn't," Ethan said. "She'd think it was interfering." Clara stirred the pot, set down the spoon, pressed her hands flat on the counter. "This place?" she said quietly to herself as much as to him. "What about it?" She turned around, looked at the kitchen that she had reorganized, and the window she had cleared, and the curtains she was going to hang, and the man at the table who had chosen her letter because she told the truth, and Martha Ellis who had stood at the end of a platform to watch a frightened girl arrive and make a silent decision about her. "This place," she said again. "It's been trying to be home for me since before I knew it." Ethan looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The week that followed the storm was when Silver Creek changed its mind about Clara Callahan. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Small towns didn't work that way, and Clara had no illusions that they did. But the storm had been witnessed, not the blizzard itself, but its aftermath, the story of it, which traveled the way all stories traveled in Silver Creek, which was faster than news and louder than fact. Frank told Martha. Martha told 3 people. Those 3 people told others. And the version that traveled was not about a mail-order bride from Boston. It was about a woman who had tied a rope to a porch post and walked into a blizzard to find her husband. Dillard, when she came in the following Wednesday, greeted her by her name for the first time. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, and meant it as a title rather than as a description of what she was. She bought her supplies. She said thank you. She walked out. On the boardwalk, she passed Mrs. Hargrove, who stopped and looked at her and said, "I heard what you did in the storm." "I did what needed doing," Clara said, not to minimize it, because that was what it was. Mrs. Hargrove looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing something complicated. "Yes," she said finally. "I suppose you did." It wasn't an apology. Clara didn't need it to be an apology. What it was an adjustment, the particular small important adjustment of a person revising a judgment they had made too quickly. That was enough. More than enough. She drove home thinking about the curtains. She had found material for them in town. A deep blue, not impractical. Practical enough that Ethan wouldn't look at it and think it was decoration rather than function, which she had learned mattered to him. She had cut them the previous evening and spent an hour on the seams. When she hung them that afternoon in the front window, she stood back and looked at them for a long time. They were the first thing she had put in this house that was purely hers. Not repair, not function, not maintenance. Hers. Something she had chosen because she wanted it there. She heard Ethan come in behind her. She heard him stop. "Blue," he said. "Is that a problem?" A pause. Then James's favorite color was blue. She looked at the curtains, then at him over her shoulder. He was looking at the window with an expression that held grief and something else in equal measure, something that was not grief at all. "I didn't know that," she said. "I know you didn't," he said quietly. "That's not why I'm telling you." She waited. "I'm telling you," he said, "because this house hasn't felt like it belonged to anyone for 4 years, and those curtains—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "It looks like someone lives here." Clara looked back at the curtains. "Someone does," she said. He came to stand beside her, not touching, just beside her, looking at the blue curtains in the afternoon light. "Yeah," he said softly. "Someone does." And in that moment, in that ordinary, quiet, complete moment, Clara Callahan understood that home was not a place you arrived at. It was something you built day by day, choice by choice, in the space between two people who had decided to keep choosing each other. She had been building it since the day she stepped off a train with one suitcase and shaking hands. She hadn't known that then. She knew it now. The curtains stayed blue all winter. Clara noticed things like that now. The permanence of small decisions, the way objects accumulated meaning over time until they became part of the story of a place rather than just its furniture. The blue curtains caught the morning light differently than she had expected and threw something warm across the kitchen floor every clear day, and she had stopped noticing them consciously the way you stop noticing anything that becomes genuinely yours. They were just there. Part of the house. Part of the life. December came in quieter than November, which Martha had warned her about. The worst storms of the year aren't always the loudest. Martha had told her over coffee the week after the blizzard. Sometimes December is peaceful, right up until it isn't. Don't let the quiet make you careless. Clara had not let the quiet make her careless, but she had let it make her something else. Settled. That was the word. She had been here 3 months, and the life of the ranch had stopped feeling like something she was learning and started feeling like something she knew. She could read the sky the way Ethan read it. She could tell the difference between the cattle sounds that meant nothing and the ones that meant something. She knew which boards in the kitchen floor creaked and avoided them in the early morning so as not to wake Ethan before she'd had 20 minutes of quiet to herself. 20 minutes she had come to guard with a fierceness that surprised even her, because she had never had the luxury of quiet that belonged to her before, and she had discovered she loved it the way you love something you were always supposed to have. Ethan's ribs had healed by mid-December. He had let her dictate the pace of his recovery with a patience that cost him visibly, but that he maintained because she had earned the right to insist on it, and he knew it, and they both knew he knew it. The morning he declared himself fully functional, an announcement made while lifting a feed sack that was clearly heavier than advisable. She had watched from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and said nothing. Because sometimes the most effective response to a stubborn man was to let him demonstrate his own limitations and then not mention it when he came in at noon, moving more carefully than he'd left. "Ribs still talking?" she asked, setting coffee in front of him. "Whispering," he said. "I'll accept whispering." He looked at her over the cup, the look that had become as familiar to her as the kitchen floor, the one that was simply him, plainly without performance. "You're going to be managing my health decisions for the rest of my life," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "You'll get used to it." "I'm used to it," he said. "I'm just noting it." She sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the comfortable silence that had taken 3 months to build and was now one of her most valued possessions. The kind of silence that didn't need filling. The kind that meant both people were present and at ease and had nothing to prove to each other. She had not told him she loved him yet. She was still deciding when. Not if that question had answered itself in the dark of the blizzard and stayed answered. But when? It wasn't the kind of thing she was willing to say carelessly, and she was still too newly arrived in the territory of trusting herself to trust that the moment was right. She would know. She had been right about enough things recently to believe she would know. The moment came, sooner than she expected, and from a direction that reminded her, as Silver Creek had a way of reminding her that nothing here happened the way she planned it. It came from the schoolhouse. She had written to Reverend Hayes in late November, as she'd told Ethan she would, asking whether there was a need for teaching assistants at the Silver Creek schoolhouse. The Reverend's reply came back promptly. The schoolhouse had 17 children, and one teacher who was managing the load alone, and had been for 2 years. And was. The Reverend wrote with considerable understatement welcoming of help. The teacher's name was Mr. Aldous Webb, a thin, precise man of about 50 who had been teaching in Silver Creek since the previous decade, and who greeted Clara on her first visit with the particular wariness of a person who has been promised assistance before and received disappointment instead. He showed her around the schoolhouse in about 4 minutes. He gave her the student roster. He told her the 3 children who were behind grade level, the 2 who were advanced enough to be bored, and the one a boy of 11 named Henry Greer, who was smart enough for university someday if someone could get him to stop spending every lesson looking out the window. "I can work with Henry," Clara said. Mr. Webb looked at her sideways. "Everyone says that." "What do the others do when they say that?" "They give him more difficult work. He does it in half the time and then goes back to looking out the window." "That's because he needs something harder than the work," Clara said. "He needs a reason for it. What does he care about?" Mr. Webb paused. "He knows every horse on every ranch in a 20-mile radius. Names, temperaments, histories. Then we start with that," Clara said. "Reading about horses. Writing about horses. Mathematics applied to feed costs and breeding records. Once he's engaged, you shift the content, but you catch him first." Mr. Webb looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "I taught myself," she said. "From books. Which means I know how to make a book feel necessary rather than obligatory." She paused. "I'd like to try with the 3 who are behind as well, if you'll let me." He let her. She went on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Within 3 weeks, Henry Greer had stopped looking out the window. Within 4, one of the children who had been behind was caught up with his grade level, and the other 2 were closing the gap. Mr. Webb, who had initially watched her work with the visible tension of a man waiting for something to go wrong, began leaving her alone with the students for longer and longer stretches, which was from him a comprehensive endorsement. The children talked to their parents. The parents talked to each other. And the conversation about Clara Callahan in Silver Creek shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular way of reputations being rebuilt. Fact by fact, the most durable kind of revision. Ethan heard it before she told him. He came home from town one Thursday in mid-December and set his supplies on the table and said without preamble, "Greer told me in the feed store today that his boy Henry is reading ahead of grade level." Clara looked up from the bread she was making. "He said it like, I should already know," Ethan continued. "I may have mentioned it to Martha." "Martha told everyone." Martha tells everyone everything. I've adapted my communication strategy accordingly. He looked at her across the kitchen. Something moved in his face that she recognized now, the specific expression that meant he was feeling something larger than he planned to say. You're becoming somebody here, he said quietly. You know that. She looked at her hands in the dough. Flower white work rough belonging to a life she had built from the ground up with those same hands. I know, she said, quietly. I can feel it. It was the truth. She could feel it not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The way Dillard greeted her. The way the mothers of her students stopped her on the street to talk. The way the town was making room for her in the way towns make room for people who have proven themselves worth making room for. She was not Boston Clara anymore, the frightened girl with one suitcase who didn't know anyone and didn't know anything. She was Silver Creek Clara, which was something she was still becoming, but was becoming steadily. She was still thinking about this when Ethan said her name. She looked up. He was standing at the table, not moving, with an expression on his face that she had not seen before, not constrained the way he used to be, not performing steadiness. Something more open, more at risk. I need to say something, he said. She waited. I know I'm not someone who says things easily. He stopped, started again. I've been sitting on this because I didn't know if the time was right, and then I decided that waiting for the time to be right is how 4 years got away from me, so. He met her eyes directly. I love you. I think I've been in love with you since the fence, the first one, the morning after you arrived. Clara stared at him. The fence, she said. You asked me what you could do, and then you went out in the cold and you learned the grip in 20 minutes, and you didn't complain once. He paused. And I thought this woman is going to be all right. And then I thought, he stopped. I thought I had absolutely no idea what I'd done finding you, how good it was going to be. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down the bread. She moved around the table to where he was standing, and she looked up at him, and she said the thing she had been holding carefully for months with both hands. I love you, she said. I've known it since the night of the storm, the night I went looking for you. She paused. I love you the way I've wanted to love someone my whole life, not because I need you to rescue me, because you're the first person who ever stood next to me and expected me to be capable, and then let me be. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way you hold something you are aware of the value of, and she let him, and they stood in the blue-curtained kitchen of the house that was theirs, in the December quiet, and everything that had been building since Boston, since the train, since the platform at Silver Creek, and the hammer and the fence and the rope in the blizzard settled into place, the way the last piece of something settles completely, and finally, and without fanfare. The kiss was not dramatic. It was not a declaration or a performance. It was simply two people who had been telling each other the truth for 3 months, doing the same thing in a different language. It was enough. It was more than enough. Christmas in Silver Creek was nothing like Christmas in Boston. Clara had thought she was prepared for this and discovered she was not, but not in the way she expected. She wasn't unprepared for the cold or the isolation or the lack of the busy holiday commerce she'd known in the city. She was unprepared for how much she liked it. The Silver Creek Christmas involved the church which she attended for the first time on Christmas Eve, alongside Ethan, who had been attending alone for 4 years, and sat beside her in the pew with the easy naturalness of a man who has stopped being alone and intends to remain stopped. Martha and Frank were 3 rows ahead. Bess turned around twice to wave at Clara, and Clara waved back, and Martha did not turn around, but her shoulders performed the very particular movement of a woman trying not to smile at something she is pretending not to notice. Reverend Hayes's sermon was about the nature of belonging, about how the human need for home was not a weakness, but a design, the thing that kept people from simply drifting until they disappeared. He spoke about how sometimes home was the place you were born, and sometimes it was the place you built, and sometimes it was a person, and how all 3 were equally real. Clara sat in that pew and listened, and felt with complete steadiness that he was describing her life. After the service outside in the cold Silver Creek gathered the way it gathered, loosely, warmly, with the particular ease of people who know each other's histories and have decided to show up anyway. Several people came to speak to Clara. Mr. Webb, the Greers, two women who had been part of Mrs. Hargrove's social circle, and who now spoke to Clara with the adjusted register of people who had revised a judgment, and were quietly acknowledging the revision without making a speech of it. Mrs. Hargrove herself appeared at Clara's elbow near the end of the gathering. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble, without decoration. Apparently she had decided that this was the moment and intended to commit to it. Clara looked at her. "I made assumptions," Mrs. Hargrove said, "about what you were and what you'd be. I said things that were not fair." She met Clara's eyes briefly, then away, then back. "I've been watching you for 3 months. You're not what I assumed." "No?" Clara agreed simply. "I'm not." Mrs. Hargrove nodded once, a short definitive movement. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Callahan." "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Hargrove," Clara said. It was not an effusive reconciliation. It was not the beginning of a deep friendship. But it was real, the honest acknowledgement of a real revision, and Clara valued real things above almost everything else. Ethan appeared beside her as Mrs. Hargrove moved away. "What was that?" he asked quietly. "An apology," she said. He looked at her. "You handled that well." "I accepted what she gave," she said. "That's all." He took her hand as they walked to the wagon. Not a grand gesture, just his hand finding hers in the cold, natural, and sure, as if it had been doing this for years rather than weeks. She let herself feel the warmth of it all the way home. The twist that January brought was not a storm. It was a letter, not from Gerald. She had not heard from Gerald again, and did not expect to. This letter came from a different direction entirely. It was addressed to Ethan on paper, with a lawyer's letterhead from Billings, and its arrival was so ordinary, just a letter in the weekly mail collected on a Tuesday, that neither of them thought anything of it until Ethan opened it at the kitchen table and his face changed. Clara saw the change and set down what she was doing. "What is it?" she asked. He read it again before answering. She watched him read it the second time, and saw the particular expression of a man processing something that is simultaneously good news and complicated. "My uncle," he said, "my mother's brother. He died in November." "Ethan." "We weren't close," he said quickly. "I barely knew him. He came out west before I was born, settled in California. I met him twice as a child." He set the letter on the table. "He left his estate to James and me." Clara went still. "James has been gone 4 years." "I know." He looked at the letter. "Which means he left it to me." "What is the estate?" He looked up at her. His expression was not what she expected. Not excited, not calculating, not the expression of a man running through the possibilities. It was more careful than that. "Money," he said. "Enough to expand the herd significantly. Buy the additional acreage east of our fence line that I've been wanting for 3 years. Rebuild the shelter properly. Build a second barn." He paused. "Build a bigger house." A silence. "Say what you're thinking," Clara said. He looked at her directly. "I'm thinking that this ranch is not going to be a small operation anymore. I'm thinking that changes what our life looks like." He paused. "I'm thinking I want to know what you think before I decide anything." She looked at him for a long moment. This was the man she had married, she thought. Not the surface, not the tall cowboy on the platform, or the man who drove a hard fence line. The interior. The man who received news that would change his financial life completely, and the first thing he did was ask her what she thought. "I think," she said carefully, "that a bigger house means a room for a schoolroom. Books a real desk. I've been borrowing Mr. Webb's materials and bringing them home, and there's only so much I can manage at the kitchen table." He blinked. "That's your first thought?" "My first thought was that you asked me before you decided," she said. "My second thought was the schoolroom." Something moved in his face that was enormous and quiet at the same time. "Done," he said. "The schoolroom. Whatever you need for it." "And the garden has to double," she said. "If we're expanding the operation, we're feeding more people. I want the south side as well as the east." "Done. And I want to hire fairly," she said. "When you take on ranch hands for the expanded herd, I know how men are hired out here. I know what's offered and what's not. I want them paid properly and treated properly, because the kind of people who'll work hard for you are the kind who know when they're being respected." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no word for. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was not a real question, but she answered it like one. "Boston," she said. "One suitcase. Terrified." "And now?" She looked around the kitchen, at the blue curtains, at the Bible on the shelf that had come from the crate and now had a permanent home, at the bread rising near the stove, and the tools hanging on the wall, and the seeds she had sorted and labeled and stored carefully for spring. "Now I'm home," she said, "and I have opinions about the garden." He laughed. The real laugh unguarded the one that had been coming more easily for months. Now, the one that changed his face completely, and that she intended to spend a very long time continuing to cause. Spring arrived with the particular ferocity that Montana reserved for the end of things it had been holding back all winter. The kitchen garden went in on the first week the ground would take seed. Clara worked it herself for the first 3 days, with Ethan appearing at intervals to help with the heavier digging and making no comment on the scale of what she was planting, which was considerably larger than anything he had envisioned when she mentioned doubling the garden. She had designed it with the same logic she had applied to everything since arriving, practically with an understanding of what was needed and a refusal to do it halfway. Martha came to see it when the first seedlings appeared. She stood at the edge of it with her hands on her hips and looked it over with the critical eye of a woman who had been growing things in Montana soil for 14 years. "This is good work," she said finally. "It will be," Clara said. "By summer." "You planned it right, the drainage especially." Martha crouched down and looked at the seedling rows. "You've been thinking about this all winter." "Since November," Clara said. "I drew it out on paper 3 times before I settled on the layout." Martha looked up at her. "You know what I said to Frank when you first arrived? He told Ethan. Ethan told me that you'd be one of the best people in the county if I lasted 2 months. Martha stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I was right." "You were optimistic," Clara said. "I was accurate," Martha said with the particular firmness of a woman who does not apologize for correct assessments. "I knew what I was looking at on that platform. A person who had been carrying too much alone for too long and was still standing. That's a specific kind of strong." She looked at Clara steadily. "The kind that grows." Clara looked at the garden, at the small green things coming up in the rows she had planned in the winter dark. "She wouldn't recognize me," Clara said. "Who?" "The girl on the platform." She paused. She was so scared. She had learned to be scared in the place she came from. She thought being scared was permanent. And now? Clara thought about the blizzard, about Ethan's face in the firelight, about Henry Greer reading ahead of grade level and Mrs. Hargrove's short, honest apology, and the curtains and the bread and the morning quiet that was hers. About a man who had asked her what she thought before he made a decision that changed their lives. "Now I know the difference," she said, "between being scared of what might happen and being grounded in what is." She looked at Martha. "I'm grounded. For the first time in my life. I know where I am." Martha put her arm around Clara's shoulders briefly, a compact, genuine gesture from a woman who wasn't given to theatrical ones. "Good," she said. "That's all it takes in the end, knowing where you are." The second barn went up in May. Ethan hired 6 men for the expansion ranch hands he had vetted carefully at wages that were fair, which turned out to attract exactly the quality of people Clara had told him it would. She had been right about that, the way she was right about most things, which he acknowledged without ceremony by saying, "You were right." The morning the first hire showed up and turned out to be the best stockman in the county who had been waiting, it emerged for someone to simply offer him what the work was actually worth. You were right, Ethan said. I know, she said. He looked at her sidelong. You're going to keep doing that, he said. Probably. She agreed. But she was smiling when she said it, and so was he. The schoolroom was finished in June. 2 bookshelves. A desk she had chosen herself from the catalog large enough to spread out multiple books at once. A small chalkboard on the wall. Light from the east window that she had positioned deliberately because morning light was best for reading, and she had made her peace with the fact that she thought about things like that now that she was the kind of person who planned light. The first student to use it was Henry Greer, who appeared at the door one Saturday morning with 3 questions about the history of the horse in the American West that Mr. Webb had not been able to fully answer. Clara sat him down at the desk and spent 2 hours with him. At the end of it, he looked up at her with the expression of a boy who has had the experience of a subject opening up from the inside. "Can I come back next week?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And bring what you've written. We're going to start working on how you put an argument together on paper." He left already thinking about it. She could see it in the way he walked. She stood in the doorway of her schoolroom in her house that was no longer small on her land, that was no longer struggling in her town, that had made room for her one honest act at a time, and she felt the fullness of everything she had built so quietly that she had almost missed it happening. She heard Ethan behind her. "How'd it go?" he asked. "He's going to be extraordinary," she said. "The boy, Henry, give him 2 years and something to aim at, and he's going to be extraordinary." She turned. Ethan was leaning in the doorway of the hall with his arms crossed and the afternoon behind him. She had looked at him across rooms 100 times by now, and it still did something to her that she had given up being cautious about. "I want to write to the university in Bozeman to find out what their entry requirements are, so I can make sure he meets them." Ethan looked at her. "He's 11, he said. "I know," she said. "That's why we start now." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, write the letter." She nodded. Then she looked at him standing there, this man, this plain, difficult, generous, steady man who had placed an honest advertisement in a newspaper because he was lonely and ended up with something neither of them had known to ask for, and she said, "Ethan." "Yeah. Do you know what you gave me?" He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze. "A home," he said quietly. "I hope." "More than that," she said. "You gave me back myself. The person I was before I was told I wasn't enough. Before I learned to be invisible." She felt her voice go steady around something large. "I came here with 1 suitcase and the belief that a chance was all I needed. You gave me the chance. Everything else I did myself." She paused. "But I needed the chance, and you were the one who gave it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and stood in front of her and put his hand against her face in the careful way he had, and looked at her with everything he didn't have words for, which was considerable. "You gave me mine back too," he said. "In case you didn't know that." She leaned her forehead against his jaw. "I knew," she said, and she had. She had watched him come back to himself the way the land came back after winter, slowly without announcement, one small green thing at a time, until one day you looked and it was full and alive, and impossible to imagine it had ever been bare. Years later, when people in Silver Creek told the story of Clara Callahan, and they did tell it the way small towns tell the stories of people who become part of their character, they always started the same way. She arrived terrified. 1 suitcase, 1 chance. 18 years old and running toward something she couldn't name, because what she was running from had finally used up the last of its claim on her. And then, depending on who was telling it, the story emphasized different things. The blizzard, the schoolroom, the garden, the curtains. Henry Greer, who did go to university, who came back to Silver Creek afterward and taught for 30 years and named his first daughter Clara without being asked. But the truest version of the story was the simplest one. A girl who had been told she wasn't enough discovered that the people who told her that were wrong. A lonely man who had stopped believing the world would give him anything good discovered that it would. And together in a house on the Montana range with blue curtains and a kitchen garden and a schoolroom full of books. They built a life so solid and so real that it became one of those lives that other people point to when they are trying to explain what it looks like when something works the way it was meant to. Not perfect, not easy, not the life either of them had planned. Better than that, the life they had chosen, every single day.